Story 1. Borrowed lungs in room 309. My name is Sarah Ellis. For 10 years, I've worked as an ICU nurse at St. Judas Hospital. Our hospital is one of those old 1960s buildings, a place where the walls reek of mildew, dampness, and death. In these 10 years, I've learned that death isn't necessarily a single moment, it's a process. Sometimes the soul leaves before the body, and sometimes the body carries something dark with it instead of letting go. It all started on a rainy night. In room 309, an old man named Arthur Mason was admitted. He was a former miner in the final stages of lung failure. His only companion was a small, vintage pocket radio that played nothing but static. Arthur used to say, "This sound reminds me of the deep earth, Sarah. There is never absolute silence down there." At 3:33 a.m., Arthur's monitor began to flatline. When I arrived, he was propped up in bed, pointing in terror at an empty chair in the corner of the room. His lips were moving as if he were pleading with someone I couldn't see. Moments later, he passed away. As I pulled the sheet over his face, the room suddenly turned ice cold. Arthur's radio, which had no batteries in it, suddenly flickered to life and whispered, "I'm not giving it all back. Not yet." The next night, a young patient named Mark was admitted to the same room. At 2:00 a.m., Mark hit the nurse's call button in a panic. "Sarah, who is that old miner?" he gasped. "He keeps leaning over me, breathing into my mouth. He says he wants my lungs." Suddenly, the stench of damp earth filled the room, and Mark's oxygen machine failed for no medical reason. It was as if unseen hands were crushing his throat. After that night, I searched the archives. I discovered that years ago, deep in a mine, Arthur had cut his coworker's oxygen line just to keep himself alive a few minutes longer. He had spent his whole life stealing the breath of others, and now, in death, he waits in room 309 to claim the lungs of the next patient. Story 2. Alien Heartbeats. I am Dr. Alexander Vogt, a cardiac surgeon. Science tells us the heart is just a pump, but an incident at Blackwater Hospital killed that belief in me. We transplanted the heart of a young man named Julian, who had drowned under suspicious circumstances, into a man named Eric. The moment the heart was connected, the monitors displayed strange noise, and a sound like a piercing scream erupted from the speakers. A week later, Eric woke up, but he was inconsolable. He kept saying he could hear the sound of water being poured over his face and felt like he was suffocating. In his dreams, he saw his hands and feet tied while a woman held his head underwater. Eric would scream the name of a woman named Clara in terror, a name he should never have known. Eric began describing details of a forest cabin and a cast-iron bathtub that weren't even in the police files. I conducted a private investigation and found out that Julian hadn't drowned in a river. He had been suffocated in salt water. During one of his episodes, Eric hissed, "Clara thinks she escaped, but I am still beating here in this chest." The evidence is under the cabin floorboards. Based on this information, the police arrested Clara, Julian's fiancée. She had murdered him for his life insurance. Now, every time I listen to Eric's heartbeat, I feel a slight pause between every throb. A pause that sounds like a whisper. Julian's heart never forgot who stopped it from beating. Story 3. Cross echoes in room 204. My name is Nicholas Storm. On the night of February 14th, something happened in our hospital that defied all mathematical probability. At 2:22 a.m., a 30-year-old woman named Elena Vance was brought in after a car accident. She wore a silver necklace with the number 2 engraved on it. 10 minutes later, another ambulance arrived with a woman who had suffered a sudden cardiac arrest on a sidewalk. When they wheeled the stretcher in, the entire medical staff froze. She was a carbon copy of the first woman, same name, same date of birth, same clothes. The only difference was her necklace. It was engraved with the number 1. The first Elena died at 2:40 a.m. At that exact moment, the second Elena snapped her eyes open. She grabbed my wrist with a grip like cold steel and said in a metallic voice, "One of us had to stay. She was my tomorrow and I am her yesterday. We are trapped in a circle, doctor." She asked for the time, and when I said 2:44, she let out a scream that sounded like radio static, and the entire wing lost power. When the lights flickered back on, both Alina's had vanished. Only 2 silver necklaces remained on the floor. When I picked them up and held them together, they snapped together like magnets and the numbers changed. Now both read 0. Every night at 2:22 a.m., the hospital clocks glitch, and I hear the footsteps of a woman running down the hallway asking, "Which door opens to today?" Story 4. The Reverse Whispers in the Abandoned Ward. My name is Liam Rain. I worked for 8 years in the psychiatric stabilization unit at Pinebrook Hospital. If you think the worst thing a nurse can see is open wounds or severe bleeding, you are dead wrong. The worst thing is seeing a human being whose body still walks and breathes, but whose soul has been replaced by something that doesn't belong to this world. In our ward, silence is a rule, but the night they brought in the nameless man, that silence became a weapon against my sanity. It all started on a gray Tuesday in October. Around 10:30 p.m., the ward radio flickered on with a constant static hiss. The ER announced a new patient, a man in his 40s, with no ID, found screaming in the parking lot of an old church. The police said he had no physical injuries, but his behavior was beyond simple psychosis. When they brought him to the isolation room, room 4, my blood ran cold. He wore nothing but torn sweatpants. His skin was the color of cold ash, and his hair was matted to his scalp as if he had been submerged in a cold sweat for hours. He was in plastic restraints, but he didn't resist. He just stared at the ceiling. When I entered to check his vitals, he suddenly stopped moving. I mean, he didn't even blink. I stepped closer and said, "Hi, I'm Liam, I'm your nurse. Can you tell me your name?" He slowly turned his head. His eyes, my God, his pupils were so dilated that the irises were gone, just 2 deep black wells that didn't reflect any light. His dry lips moved, but the sound that came out was like no language I had ever heard. It was a muffled sound, like an old cassette tape being played backward at high speed. I was shocked, thinking he was having a seizure, but as I listened carefully, I realized he was speaking backward. I quickly pulled out my phone and recorded his voice. Later, when I used software to reverse the audio, the blood drained from my face. He was saying, "The gate is open. Liam Rain, you hold the key." He knew my name before he had even seen my badge. That night at 2:12 a.m., while he was under heavy sedation, I was at the nursing station. Suddenly, the internal phone rang. No caller ID. I picked it up. Intense static filled the line, then that same reversed voice whispered directly into my ear, "He is not sleeping. He is watching through your eyes." I ran to room 4. Looking through the small observation window, the bed was empty. My heart leaped into my throat. But when I shone my flashlight, I saw him on the floor in the corner, huddled in an inhuman shape, silently slamming his head against the wall without making a single sound. At that moment, my sister Emily, who had been institutionalized for years in another facility, called me. She was screaming and crying, "Liam, run. The man they brought in is not human. He is a conduit. He has come to awaken what was buried in that church years ago." I didn't know how she knew, but the terror in her voice was real. At 3:07 a.m., the hospital power cut out. In total darkness, I heard footsteps in the hallway, heavy steps that sounded like they were coming from inside the walls. The smell of burning and rotting meat filled the air. I went to room 4 with my flashlight, but the heavy steel door was wide open. The nameless man stood in the middle of the hallway. He looked taller, his bones seemingly stretched under his skin. He opened his mouth impossibly wide and screamed, this time forward, in a voice that was a chorus of 100 throats. "The gatekeeper has AWAKENED." Right before my eyes, he began to vibrate, and suddenly his body collapsed like a hollow balloon. There was no blood, only a mass of black, oily smoke that crawled rapidly into the ventilation ducts. When the police arrived, there was no trace of him. Even the security cameras showed nothing but static. But the story doesn't end there. Every time I walk through those dark hallways now, I hear whispers from the vents. Words played backward. I can no longer hear English correctly. Every sentence people say is repeated backward in my brain. And worst of all, every time I look in the mirror, I feel my pupils getting a little wider. I fear the nameless man didn't leave. He just moved. He didn't just leave room 4. He moved into the room of my mind. I am now the keeper of a gate that has no lock. Story 5. The Shadow That Arrived Early. My name is Joshua Miller. I worked for 15 years in the palliative care unit at St. Bernard Hospital. My job was to help people leave this world in peace. I've seen many deaths, but nothing failed my medical logic more than the old woman in room 412. It began on a cold winter evening. An 85-year-old woman named Edith Hopper was admitted with terminal cancer. Doctors gave her 48 hours, but unlike other patients, Edith wasn't afraid. She spent all her time staring at the corner of the ceiling, whispering with a strange smile, "He's still in the hallway. He's checking the room numbers." At 1:00 a.m., Edith rang her call bell. When I entered, she pointed a trembling finger at the half-open door. "Joshua, my boy, tell him it's not my turn yet. He's gone into room 408 by mistake. Go and stop him." I told her the hallway was empty, but she insisted. The tall man with the black top hat and white gloves, he misread the list. To calm her, I checked the hall. It was empty. But as I passed room 408, occupied by a stable young man, a chill ran down my spine. 5 minutes later, the alarm for 408 went off. The young man had suffered a sudden, inexplicable cardiac arrest. As we called the time of death, I remembered Edith's words. He went into 408 by mistake. The next morning, Edith was eating breakfast happily. She said, "He apologized last night. He said it was a mistake, but he's coming back tonight for 3 people." I tried to ignore her, but by nightfall, 3 patients who were not in critical condition died mysteriously. One choked, one had a sudden allergic reaction, and one had a blood clot. At 11:00 p.m., I went to Edith's room. She was pale and gasping for air. "Joshua, he's standing behind you," she whispered. "He's asking if you're willing to take my place." I felt an icy cold on my neck like the breath of a frozen grave. Edith hissed, "He says you have a kind heart. He says instead of me, he will take the one who has played with the deaths of others all these years." At that moment, a horrific scream erupted from the nursing station. The head nurse, a man who had covered up his fatal negligence for years, was on the floor, his face bruised and eyes bulging as if strangled by invisible gloved hands. When I looked back, Edith had passed away peacefully with that same smile. But on her nightstand, there was a small, crumpled paper top hat and a pair of worn white gloves that hadn't been there before. I resigned that night. Now, whenever I look in a mirror, I fear I'll see the tall man checking his list. Death never forgets a debt. It only postpones the collection. Story 6. Protocol for Room 0. My name is Michael Watson. I was the lead security operator at the high-tech Northview Hospital in Chicago. We had over 1,000 cameras, but there was a section on the 4th basement level, B4, that was on no map. We called it the blind spot. One Friday at midnight, monitor 64, which covered the morgue hallway on B4, began to flicker. A figure appeared, a man in a vintage green surgical scrub from 40 years ago. He stood facing the camera, holding up 3 fingers. I sent a guard named David to check. On the monitor, I saw David walk right past the man, but David saw nothing. To him, the hall was empty. But on my screen, the surgeon turned his head 180 degrees to watch David pass. 10 minutes later, the surgeon appeared on the level 3 nursery camera holding up 2 fingers. He was moving between floors without being caught on any other camera. At 3:00 a.m., the camera directly behind me in the monitoring room flickered onto the main screen. The surgeon was standing right behind my chair, holding up 1 finger. I spun around. The chair was empty. On the screen, he was still there, grinning with a mouth full of sharp black teeth. I tried to call the police, but the phone only emitted the sound of a flatlining heart monitor. Every screen in the room turned black with one sentence: Surgery is about to begin. I ran to the elevator, but it took me straight to B4. The doors opened to a smell of formaldehyde and old blood. I found room 0. Inside, David was strapped to a rusted surgical table. The surgeon was hovering over him. He looked at the camera, knowing I was watching, and began pulling glowing, thread-like strands out of David's body, extracting his digital memory. A voice like static filled my head. "We need observers, Michael. You watched so well. Now it's your turn to be part of the system." The next morning, I was found unconscious. David was never seen again. The hospital said he resigned. But I see him now. Every time I look at the monitors, David is there, standing in the corner of the frame, pleading with the camera. I quit, but the nightmare follows. Every time I take a photo or stand before a lens, I see myself standing behind me, smiling. Cameras see the naked truth of death lurking between the pixels. And now, I am the one waiting to hold up the number 0.